The United Nations Development Programme is raising red flags over what they describe as bias on the part of three of the world's biggest credit rating agencies against some African countries, including the Republic of Ghana. In its latest report on lowering the cost of borrowing in Africa, the UNDP says the continued downgrade of Ghana's economy is based on less subjective assessments and is costing the state and other African countries some $74 billion. With this amount of money saved, it is more likely that Ghana may not have signed up for a $3 billion bailout from the IMF. Foreign Affairs correspondent Blessed Soga has an exclusive interview with Ahuna Eziakonwa, the regional director of the UNDP, which shed more light on the report. He joins us with more. Blessed, which rating agencies have been cited and why is the UNDP accusing them of bias?
Aisha, it's a good time to be talking to you as we look forward to that interview with the regional head of the United Nations Development Programme later tonight on Foreign Affairs. The interaction centered on the annual meetings of the Afri-Exim Bank, which is focused on the theme of building prosperity for the continent or for Africans. Now, a key concern has been the emerging debt crisis that many continents, many countries on the African continent are presented with. Of course, the UNDP is one of the key development partners for countries such as Ghana and other developing nations around the world. So I sought to get the perspective of the UNDP on attaining the US SDGs, which part of the target focuses on not leaving anyone behind by 2030 as far as the Sustainable Development Goals is concerned. And given this eminent debt crisis that is facing most of the African nations, there are fears that we may not be able to meet these targets. Now, when I put that to the UNDP, a key concern that came up has got to do with financing for these developing nations. And it's instructive to note that the UNDP has carried out a research which is pointing out that there seems to be bias on the part of three key top rating agencies, Standard & Poor's, Fitch, and they talk about one other in the report, which they say that cumulatively, if you put together the way they go about their reporting, they shut the Ghanaian economy out of the international financial markets. And these matters appear to affect investment within our economy. For instance, they point to what they describe as pro-cyclicality of some issues or matters that are less subjective and should not necessarily matter to the economic metrics. For instance, we know that Ghana is surrounded by countries that are facing insurgency. That's a fact. But for the UNDP, these are matters that should not necessarily be on the front burner in shutting Ghana out of the international market. And these are some of the reasons for which they believe that if you take away these factors and the less subjectivity in the ratings, countries such as Ghana would have access to $75 billion, which will potentially give them an upper hand, and they may not necessarily have to go for a bailout program as we're doing now with the International Monetary Fund.
Blessed, we know that President Akufo-Addo for some time now has raised concerns over how Ghana is being shut out of the international market because of this alleged bias. What was his reason for this?
At this very same annual meetings that I'm talking about, the Afri-Exim meetings, President Akufo-Addo had the opportunity of addressing the private sector and international actors, just to try and find a way of building a proper source of finance for the continent. And as part of his concerns, he also pointed out to this alleged bias. That's how we need to treat it as of now, because there are some on the other divide who say that if you look at Ghana's economic performance, you don't need an expert to tell you that we're not doing well. But based on this report, it appears that there's some leaning towards what it is that the president has been talking about, that consistently there appears to be a stereotype or a bias against countries such as Ghana. Let's listen to him.
Speaking at the annual meetings of the Afri-Exim Bank in Accra, President Akufo-Addo said Ghana's economic difficulties were compounded by the downgrades from the rating agencies. According to him, the country, which had become the favorite child of bondholders, was suddenly shut out of the international capital markets.
And I can comfortably and convincingly say this. As the AU champion for African financial institutions and leader of a country which recently had to deal with one of the most difficult periods in its post-independent history. Difficulties which were exacerbated by the reckless behavior of rating agencies that engaged
Blessed, we know emphatically that Ghana is not in a good economic position. Is the UNDP actually saying that this should not warrant a downgrade?
They believe that when you're looking at the factors that should matter, some of the obvious situations and situations that countries, for instance, such as Ghana, cannot change, should not matter in the reason for which you would downgrade as. But I put that to Ezenkoa, who happens to be the regional director for the United Development Program. And just as President Akufo-Addo is using that harsh word of reckless rating on the part of the ratings agency, they seem to suggest that, well, it may not be a case that they are reckless in the ratings, except to say that there are less subjective matters that should be should not matter when it comes to the ratings that are given to countries such as Ghana. And based on this, we're losing to the tune of $75 billion US. Potentially that could save us from not going to the IMF, for instance, for a $3 billion bail.
It's an issue, but there are ways to make finances cheaper for the continent. That's something we have to look at, and we've been looking at it at UNDP. For instance, we just did a study on the cost of borrowing and the credit rating bias that puts African countries at a disadvantage. If we can deal with that, you save $75 billion a year for just 16 countries that we surveyed.
Are you saying this is becoming a reality? Because our president raised that during the AfriExim meetings, where there's this continental push for our own standards and ratings. Is that the solution to the problem?
That's part of the solution. I mean, you will always have to participate in the international rating agencies because they have a standard.
Because we can't do without them.
Exactly. Yeah. But I think that you can influence how they rate Africa, and it comes back to the perceptions